So I have the pleasure of introducing Ron Unger. He's a therapist and educator specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and related approaches for psychosis. He's interested in the intersection of trauma, dissociation, psychosis, and spirituality, and his work is informed by his own personal experience of that intersection. Within ISPS, he is the chair of the education committee, the president of the Pacific Northwest branch, and a moderator for our listserv. And today he will be presenting integrating cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis with parts work and an internal family systems approach. So please join me today in welcoming Ron Unger.
Yeah, well, welcome to all of you. I'd also like to extend a welcome to all of your parts, even to the parts that you might not usually get along with that well. That might seem like an odd welcome, but it might make more sense as we go on. So I myself am a therapist specializing, as Hallie said, in CBT for psychosis, but I'm always interested in expanding and improving what I do, for example, by integrating ideas from other approaches. And so one key thing I've been struggling with is how to reconcile CBT with approaches that frame themselves as working with the parts of a person. I'd like to note if I had more time, I could describe both CBT for psychosis and then some of the parts approaches, and then talk about the areas of contrast and contradiction. But since our time is limited, I'm going to just jump straight into exploring the areas where the approaches seem to conflict. I'm guessing that you're going to find that what I'm saying makes some sense, even if you don't already know about some or all of the approaches that I'm going to be discussing. So what I like about CBT for psychosis is that it's relatively simple and straightforward. And it's great to have some simple and grounded concepts when you're working with extreme and confusing mental states. But I think CBT can run into problems that when it doesn't acknowledge and work explicitly with parts. Like, for example, in CBT, we're often trying to stop or replace dysfunctional thinking or behavior or something like that, but then it keeps coming back for reasons we don't understand. Or a person may intellectually completely agree that their apparently dysfunctional belief is wrong, so it's a sense that they're in danger. Well, I know I'm not really in danger. And they can't identify a reason why they feel in danger, and yet it keeps seeming to be true, and they can't figure out what to do about it. So the person themselves might really be frustrated with themselves for continuing to have a belief which they think is irrational. And that's where it can really kind of help to have a parts perspective, because where we might say, well, part of you seems to believe that you're in danger. And then we can work on getting to know that part. Like maybe need to help you get to know the part of you that thinks you're in danger. And then we can coach the person and how to treat the part that believes it's in danger. We can approach it in a kind and curious way, the way we might a child who has fears. Like we all know that when we approach a child in that kind of way, they're more likely to tell us exactly what they're afraid of and why. And then we can either maybe reassure them that, that they really are okay, like when the fear is like monsters under the bed. Or sometimes we end up helping them with a real threat, like when we found out they're being bullied and they need some help with that. Now, another thing a parts approach can do is help untangle some of the complex stuff that goes on with extreme experiences and beliefs. For example, consider a person who sometimes believes that they're the Antichrist. In standard CBT for psychosis, we might ask, well, how much do you believe it? Like as a percentage, rate it from 0 to 100. But I think a parts approach can uncover a bit more complexity. We can be curious, well, what part of you believes that you're the Antichrist? And when is that part more likely to take over? And then we can be curious, like, why is it important to that part to believe that it's the Antichrist and that sort of thing?
Excuse me, what our part is longitudinal when they're a child, when they're adult, or they won't, when they're husband, or when they're
I'd rather we hold questions till the end. It's good. And then we might also get to know other parts of them that are upset with them for thinking that they're the Antichrist. It helps to uncover some of the complexity of how the person is thinking. And when we get to know appreciate that inner complexity, I think we have a better chance of helping the person return to harmony. Now, some people think that, well, CBT is kind of wedded to what some have called the unitary conception of the mind, that the mind is all one. And so they think that a parts approach would be inconsistent with CBT, but that's not completely true. For example, if you look at the approach to therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is often called third wave CBT, they often accept that there is something like parts, though their relationship with them is a little weird. For example, this comes from a video that's available online using a standard acceptance and commitment metaphor that basically the person is like the driver of the bus or the plane or whatever, and then we have passengers who kind of like harass us and might say things like, nobody likes you, don't go to the party or whatever. And the idea is we get in trouble often by either trying to kick the passengers off the plane, which doesn't work, or we get in trouble by listening to them and letting them tell us where to go. And the ideal in acceptance and commitment therapy is to accept that you have the passengers, but then commit to going to the direction you value going. So anyway, they believe we have something like parts, but their basic idea is, well, let's kind of like just not pay that much attention to them and instead just pay attention to where we want to go. And other approaches like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy also talk about having parts. Like a guiding principle of that therapy is, John Teasdale, the founder, was fond of saying, we don't have one mind, but many. But again, the idea was often to like, well, just accept that you have all these different minds, but then just, basically let go of them. Don't pay too much attention to them, kind of. And my critique of that would be, it's sort of like accepting and tolerating that your kid is distressed and then going on with what you want to do and not really tuning into the kid and, well, why are they distressed and what's going on and what kind of help do they want or something like that. So anyway, I'm curious especially about approaches to parts work that go beyond just accepting and tolerating the parts, and especially as I'll get into, parts that or approaches to therapy that bring in the role of compassion. There are lots of schools of therapy that work with parts, or sometimes they use different names like ego states or subpersonalities, or even schema therapy, as schemas are kind of like parts. But again, I'm going to focus on approaches that work on how to approach parts in a compassionate and curious way. And so two of those are compassion-focused therapy that some of you might know about, and internal family systems therapy, abbreviated I. Often just use the abbreviated IFS. It's pretty. One barrier to doing parts work is the idea that having parts of us itself is pathological. Richard Schwartz, the founder of internal family systems, said that the mainstream view is either that you're crazy and you have parts and you hear voices and you have multiple personality disorder, or you just have one mind that just has different thoughts. It's either or, there's no in between. And a real problem is that once people notice or experience that they do have inside different voices or personalities, they can feel that they must be different from others in a way that must be pathological, because after all, everybody else is united. But the alternative view is that they might just be more self-aware. Like Richard Schwartz himself said, when he got to know himself, he's like, whoa, there's a lot of different parts in there. So anyway, that thought, we in CBT, we say, well, we have thoughts and feelings and all that, but thoughts and feelings don't just exist in a vacuum. They associate with each other, like all, the thoughts and feelings that you have that want to go on vacation kind of associate with each other, and the kind that just want to stay and work, they associate with each other. And pretty soon you've got different parts of you. Well, one part of me wants to keep working, one part of me wants to go on vacation. So it quickly gets complex inside. In fact, Jung called it complexes. That was another word for parts. So one question I want to ask you, this is one Richard Schwartz likes to ask audiences. How many of you have multiple personalities? Raise your hand. Yeah, and Richard Schwartz looks forward to the day when everybody's going to raise their hand. Because, you know, he'd clarify that he's not asking who has multiple personality disorder, because that means you have parts that don't work very well together, or maybe they don't even talk to each other. So one part takes over and you have amnesia for what went on. But we all have parts. It's just that when they work well together and they integrate well, we might not notice it so much, like a well-oiled team. Now, another barrier to parts work is the idea that, well, you know, parts aren't real. And from that perspective, it's not that they don't see the pathology as that the person really has parts. They see the pathology as the person thinks they have parts. And they think that's often a therapist-induced disorder, because the therapist makes people think they have parts. And so I think it's interesting to look for a minute at that question, like, you know, are parts real, or are having parts real, or are they imaginary or even hallucinated? Do we hallucinate that we have parts? Or are they just metaphors for how our different thoughts and emotion and impulses play out within our mind? Now, Richard Schwartz, again, the founder of IFS, he would say that parts are completely real and not metaphorical. And he would even say that we're born with them. On the other hand, as one therapist I know says, if we look inside our brain, we don't find any little people in there. Discrete little, you know, just distinct parts. I'd say I'd take an intermediate position and say that their parts are more like organizations or self-organizing patterns within the mind, kind of like eddies or waves or whirlpools in water. They were kind of always there in some sense, but events and responses to events organize them, or they organize themselves in response to events and relationships, as Louis Malmedrano might point out. You know, and especially when there's conflict, we might notice different parts of us taking different sides in the conflict. Part of us might want to stay in a relationship. Part of us wants to get out. And once the conflict is resolved, and the roles might relax, and we might not even notice the parts anymore. Or like when you get really still, like when your mind is like that lake with no ripples, it's like it all settles down and you don't notice the parts so much. I'd also say that parts are both imaginary and real, because in the mind, imagination is how we function. It's how we organize. One question I asked to get you thinking about that is, what is the difference between having a thought and imagining that you're having a thought? I don't know. It's kind of imagining that you're having a thought is kind of how you have a thought, right? So imagining that you have a part is kind of how you have a part. You do end up having a part. So anyway, we could say there's a tension between two dangers. One is that we don't want to encourage a person to see parts of themselves as too real, like, yeah, I'm just divided up between these 5 parts, they're all fighting with each other. And some people think that approaches like IFS do make people feel themselves more divided into entrenched parts. So I'm not sure that's true. But the other thing that we have to watch out for is, you know, if people really, you know, do have something like parts going on, we want to be able to talk about that and relate to it. And it helps us work with people. So how do we balance these two threats, between these two threats? And I'd say in CBT, generally, we believe in taking a position of uncertainty and curiosity, and that's a key strategy in working towards balance. So we might best be open to how people often experience themselves as being divided into parts, but don't draw any hard lines, and be open to fluidity, like how people can seem divided into parts at one moment and they can seem united at another. And we've talked a lot about dialogical approaches today. And I think CBT, when it's done well, is very dialogical. You know, dialogue is all about hearing from different voices, wanting them all to be heard, polyphony and that. And while dialogue is essential to life, so is kind of like bringing dialogue to some kind of conclusion, at least temporarily, so we can make a decision. You know, it's fine to have 5 views about how we might do something, but sometimes it comes down to, well, now we've got to decide. We can't go on vacation at 5 places simultaneously, right? And so sometimes, you know, we have to have as the, you know, the convergence into a decision, but then after you converge on a decision, you don't want to be just stuck on that. Well, that's the way to be forever. Then you can diverge again. What are different views on how that went and what we should do next time and that sort of thing. And then, so there's this, and again, it's kind of a wave like of opening up to different views, then converging to deciding who we're going to be in a particular instance, how we're going to represent ourselves, and then opening up to inner, you know, different inner voices again. So opening up to internal dissent. You know, I would say it fits with cognitive behavioral therapy. It's more like something the way I'm trying to pull together the idea. Yeah. So anyway, the problem is if we try too hard to stay a united mind, we're going to suppress internal dissent. Like, let's say if I take a job and say, I made the right decision, I don't want to hear from parts of me that don't think I made the right decision, you know, then we might even demonize parts that dissent, you know, some part of me is saying that's stupid. Oh, it's that evil voice calling me stupid, or it's the demon, the CIA, or it's the CIA put that chip in me to say things that I don't want it to say. You know, if we, so when people try to suppress internal dissent, and it happens anyway, they often start seeing it as something external to themselves. So I think our goal is both helping people open up to internal dialogue with different views or parts, and then also helping them resolve those dialogues so they can unify enough to make decisions and act, and then again, reopen to different views. And this process goes on just the way breathing does. Now, changing the focus a little, I'd like to point out the tendency in the mental health field for people to refuse to see parts as real is related to the tendency to refuse to see voices as real. And that brings up a question that people often ask in this kind of work: are voices the same as parts? And there's not an easy answer to the question, because sometimes it seems that voices do speak directly for parts of the person that have a point of view. And other times, it seems like the voices are maybe best conceptualized as what a part of the person is imagining that others are saying. So the person is maybe hearing what they think the neighbors are saying outside, but really it's voices. Or maybe they're even their voices are something created by a part of the person to make the person behave in a way that the part wants them to behave. So for example, if the voice doesn't, if the part of the person doesn't want them to go out, it will create scary voices that make them intimidated to go out, and sometimes talking about it that way. Fortunately, to work with this, we don't need to know exactly how they have to be categorized. We can just be aware of these different options and talk to people. Well, maybe this voice is coming from, a part of you that doesn't want you to go out, or maybe this is representing your fears of what people might be saying about you, that kind of thing. And interestingly enough, it's been found that the same kind of skills that people need to relate assertively to other people are also the same as people need to relate assertively with voices, and that people that aren't very good at being assertive with other people also aren't very good at being assertive with voices, and it also relates to parts. So we'll get into that a little bit later in this talk about talking about assertiveness in that role. So I think the core of how we integrate CBT with parts work is just by noticing the central role of balance and dialogue in both approaches. I'll say a little bit more about balance, because balanced thinking is really key to CBT. CBT is often thought of by people as something like positive thinking, but good CBT considers both positive and negative evidence. and is interested in the balanced view. And it's also CBT is often thought of as supporting the rational parts of the mind in their battle with irrational or, distorted parts. But to get to what is rational, we have to be open to considering different perspectives. Each perspective might be incomplete. So it's better to think of rationality as emerging out of dialogue, out of bringing different views into relationship with each other. And then also when we're thinking about balance, it's important to recognize that life or sanity is not about having any kind of a fixed balance. One of my complexity science teachers used to say, thermodynamic equilibrium equals death. Living systems have to be kind of off balance. To move, we have to throw ourselves off balance a bit. Imagine standing perfectly balanced and then trying to walk without throwing yourself off balance even a little. In order to walk, you have to kind of throw yourself off balance a little. That's how you get moving. So again, but dialogue has very much got that back and forth, the same as walking. It's got a back and forth to it. Another thought is that to make big progress in helping people move towards healthy internal dialogue, we may have to enrich CBT by recognizing the role of compassion and facilitating balance and dialogue. That is, we might need to invoke an emotional tone of warmth and compassion, both for oneself and for our parts. Before balance and rational thinking can clearly emerge. And that's because reason and logic don't work very well when we're feeling threatened and disconnected. Compassion-focused therapy has sometimes been framed as a kind of CBT or an approach to CBT that does appreciate the role of evoking a compassionate emotional tone when trying to help people work towards balanced thinking. And compassion-focused therapy also does work explicitly with parts. And compassion-focused therapy, the idea is that we need to teach people how to think and act in a way that they call the compassion itself. People imagine the qualities they would want their compassionate self to have. It's usually qualities like being strong, courageous, wise, etc. And then they'll have the person actually feel that. What does it feel like to be that in your body? What does it feel to walk around the room feeling those qualities? And then eventually practice engaging with the other parts of themselves from the perspective of that compassionate self. And that includes engaging with voices that they hear. While internal family systems, or IFS, has a very similar idea of helping people engage parts of themselves from the perspective of a courageous, compassionate self, there's also a big contradiction with compassion-focused therapy, because internal family systems says that we don't have to teach anyone to be the compassionate self, or in IFS, they call it the self with a capital S. They would say the self is always there. The compassionate self is always there, even when you don't see it. It's like the sun behind the clouds. And the way to get to it, you just need to get the clouds to move out of the way, or in this case, the parts. You need the parts to relax and step back, and then the self will just kind of be there. So now I spent a lot of time how do I reconcile these two? That in compassion-focused therapy, they're saying you have to train and build up the compassionate self. And in IFS, they're saying it's always there from the beginning. You just need the parts to step back. But then once I heard Charlie Harriott-Maitland, who's a big compassion-focused therapy teacher, and he talked about getting people to step into the role of the compassionate self. And I thought, well, maybe stepping into the role of the compassionate self is like having the parts draw back. It's like, it's moving to something that's more central, whether you envision yourself stepping into it or whether you envision the other parts stepping back so that that's where you are. It's maybe the same thing. And that kind of helped me as a way of putting it together. Anyway, so this idea, though, of coming from the compassionate self, or in IFS, they'll call it having self-energy. That's something those of you who are familiar with it have heard that. anyway, it's really important, and I'll talk more about that. But before I get into that, I'd like to ask you guys something. Can anybody here see a problem with helping a person to be stable and feel good about themselves? Is there any way we might go too far with that? If we help people be too sure of themselves or too stable?
I'm not sure if this would be too stable, but I think in manic states, you can take on ideas that are kind of too far and sure of yourself that become, I mean, like a dangerous example would be sure that you can fly off of a building, or, something like that.
Yeah, that would be an extreme example. Yeah. And sometimes people just want to believe that what they're doing is the right thing, and they want to shut out all the critical parts, but maybe there's, a reason why they need to rethink what they're doing, especially if they're planning to jump off the building and fly, but even in other cases, and if we're too sure of ourselves, we try to shut out the parts of us that maybe think that we need to change. We need to try something different. Now, in compassion-focused therapy, one way they start getting people to think in terms of parts is to think of us and having divergent systems of thinking within our mind. And an easy simplification they use is to say that we have a threat system, I'm going to drive or resource-seeking system, and then a soothing system. And they would point out that the threat system in particular doesn't care at all if you're happy or if you're achieving anything. Because if your life is seriously in danger, that stuff doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether your career's going down the drain. If you need to leave all your papers behind as you run out of a burning house, get the hell out of the house, It doesn't matter. It doesn't care whether you're happy. But that, of course, can conflict with other parts of you that say, hey, maybe I'm overly focused on threat and I need to get on with things, or maybe I just want to feel okay and I don't want to have to think about any of this other stuff. So in compassion-focused therapy, the idea is we try to balance these different systems. And again, this is my way of picturing it. And they often talk about, they'll picture the three lower systems, and then they'll talk about the need to balance. But I decided to put it as a tetrahedron and show the compassion itself up there as the part that's doing the balancing. And considering that there's some validity in all these different parts, there's some validity in them, and that the point of view is just to balance them. They each have something. We don't want any part to dominate too much, but we don't want to shut out any part. And this also relates to in internal family systems. They will sometimes talk about the role of the self with a capital S as being like the conductor of an orchestra. It kind of like brings, it values all the parts and helps them work together. So as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to help people find a balance, but not too stable of a balance, because we're always moving and changing. What was a balance yesterday is not the right balance for today. And just like in any dialogical approach, we don't want to let just one view dominate, because no one view has it all. And it's not a fixed sanity we're aiming at. We're instead aiming at a balance that's always being challenged. So rather than framing some views or parts as too disturbing or mad or psychotic, our aim might better be to let those views and parts find their place within the dialogue, not dominating in a harmful way, but having a place somehow. Sort of like there's a truth in everything, in every view, in every part. But we just have to figure out what that is and not let it, not let it go too far. But let's look for a bit at how things commonly go wrong with parts and in our sense of ourselves. One key is that we often identify with one part and think that that part is our whole self. And then we start thinking that we shouldn't have other parts. In IFS, they'd call that being blended with a part. An example might be where we identify with a part of us that doesn't want to think anymore about a trauma that happened to us. We just want to focus on feeling safe now and getting on with our lives. And then we might try to exile other parts that do want to think more about the trauma. We don't want to hear from them. They're just bringing back bad memories. But the problem is those parts will try to be heard anyway. And then they might manifest as flashbacks or voices. Eleanor Longdon, a famous voice hearer that some of you know, she talked about how she tried to bury the parts of her that were associated with the bad things that happened to her. But as she put it, the problem was she buried them alive and they came back as voices. And various kinds of CBT, we talk about the same process of over-identifying with some mental content and then trying to get rid of other forms of inner experience, even when they don't explicitly use a parts language for it. For example, in acceptance and commitment therapy, they talk about being fused with a point of view, or emotional reasoning, where we, let one emotion make decisions for us. And then that often causes trouble. So people try to avoid experiences like I was, that fear kind of took me over. Now I want to just not feel any fear. I need to get rid of fear. And then when people are making more extreme interpretations, they will talk about certain kind of parts of themselves as more like maybe alien intruders or something put in by a brain implant. But what supports healthy functioning, again, is really where we find a way to get to know all the parts of us and the thoughts and memories associated with them, but at the same time, not over-identify with too much with any, there's, in IFS, they talk about being with a part, but not in it. So it's the same way when we, let's say, feel angry. Well, I can feel a person who can say, I feel I have some anger, but not get taken over by that anger will do better. Or another metaphor I use in a lot of my, comes from a dumb movie, but in the movie, there's a line that says, feelings are like children. It doesn't work to let them drive the car, but it also doesn't work to lock them in the trunk. And so, so basically, locking them in the trunk is like exiling them. Letting them drive the car is like being blended with them, where you think you are the part and you just let it steer. You just think you are the anger and you just, so what we want to help people do is to be able to come from their what do you call it, their central self, their compassionate self, the part that can be kind to all the parts and thoughts and feelings, but not be pushed around by them. So now I want to look more explicitly at some contradictions between, particularly with CBT and internal family systems, because internal family systems, I think it's got a lot of really great ideas, but there's also some interesting contradictions that I think it is just interesting to look at. So one contradiction that is that in CBT for psychosis, we aren't taught to think that much about who it is that we're talking to. So it's kind of typical for a CBT therapist to just think, well, I'm just talking to the client's self and hearing about their perspective and experience. And then when the client talks about, well, I feel this, and then this disturbs me, this, let's say, voice of the alien that keeps coming into my head, that disturbs me. Well, we think of who we're talking to as that's the whole person, and then they're talking to this symptom. Now in IFS, the point is more to get to know the different parts, and we're aware that the person that comes in, they may come in blended with a part of themselves. And so they may come in blended with the part of them that hates what the voice is saying, but really the voice is another important part of themselves that in order to really know the whole person, you've got to get to know that part as well. In fact, there's a cool way in IFS that they get to know if you're talking to the person's self with a capital S or if they're blended with a part. And the way you do it is you just ask the person how they're feeling towards another part of themselves. Like, how are you feeling towards the part of you that feels anxious? Oh, I'm pissed at it, or oh, I'm scared of it. Well, if they answer something like that, then in IFS, they're assuming, well, that's another part that is scared of or anxious about the anxious part. And they work at getting that part ready to step back so that the person, once the person can be kind of like calm and curious and courageous and compassionate towards that part, now they think they're coming from their true self or compassionate self, and now they're going to actually be able to relate with that part of themselves. So I think that's actually really a good perspective, and that CBT would be richer if it was more aware that, how people come in often kind of like just blended with part of themselves, and could use some help in having some of those parts step back so that they can actually approach the other parts of themselves in a more kind and curious way. And again, it does actually fit with some deeper ideas in CBT. Like in CBT, there's this idea we're supposed to be teaching people to be their own therapist. And really, when we help people learn to come from their compassionate self, or their self with a capital S, that is like teaching people how to be their own therapist. Because when you come from that point of view, you can actually do your own work pretty well. And I would say also in CBT, to be fair, when we ask people to look for all the evidence, like let's say a person, believes that their neighbors are harassing them, and then we really want to understand why they think their neighbor is harassing them. What's all the evidence that the neighbor is harassing them? And sometimes people will say, well, I have no good evidence. It's just an irrational, paranoid belief or something like that. But in that case, if you were using more of a parts approach, you might say, well, okay, so part of you thinks that's completely irrational, but the part of you that does think the neighbors are harassing you, what makes that part believe it so strongly? And that's actually can become more of a more thorough way of looking at all the evidence to really tune in to the part of them that does think there's a reason to believe the neighbors are after them. So I hope that gives you some idea of how to handle that. Now, another contradiction, I think this one is really important, is that in internal family systems, they don't usually help one part of the person learn how to stand up to other parts that might be causing a disturbance. Instead, they'll say, well, let's get to know the part that's causing the disturbance and why it's doing it and what it's protecting and how to help that and all that. And, often it's, the part that's causing the disturbance is protecting some other part that's been exiled that needs to be helped healed. And so once you do that, then, the disturbance doesn't have to happen anymore. But in CBT, in contrast, we often do help people learn to be less pushed around by disturbing or disruptive parts, whether that's helping someone give in to, resist giving in to depressed thoughts, or helping them resist command voices. That's something very common in CBT. Now, especially with psychosis, where a person's likely to be seeing the disturbing part as kind of like alien and not part of themselves, it often does seem to make sense to start by helping the part of the person that comes into your office, helping that part defend itself. Like, hey, this voice is commanding me to hurt myself. Well, help the person stand up to that voice often is a good place to start, rather than trying to convince themselves rather than try to convince them, well, let's, try to get to know this commanding voice better. That might kind of freak the person out initially. And I think that there's, Rufus May, he's a psychologist, some of you might know, but he did a presentation that's on YouTube still on mindfulness and voices. And I think he had a good perspective on that, because he first taught people how to use mindfulness just to avoid getting caught up and reacting to like disturbing voices. And so just accept the voices there and kind of like go back to your mindful focus and all that. But then he suggested that if disturbances were coming up repeatedly, that it often made sense to turn towards the disturbance and actually explore what was going on. And I think that's helpful. Another thing is like I mentioned earlier, that people often lack assertiveness skills when they're being bothered by voices. And so teaching people assertiveness skills, I think, can be helpful. Like there's this form of therapy called relating therapy, which is like a kind of CBT. But what they do is practice the person doing role plays, relating to the voice in an assertive way. And by that, they mean both respect the voice here, respecting themselves, but also respecting the voice as they talk to it. And that having that respect, I think, is really important. And you can combine that with curiosity. I think in relating therapy, they don't combine it with curiosity as much as they might. But let's say the voice is just saying, kill yourself, right? And so saying back to it might be, well, actually, I really, want to live, and I that's what I plan to do. I'm not going to kill myself, but I'm curious why you keep saying that. Are you distressed? What's going on? So that can actually be part of assertiveness is bringing in the curiosity. And again, I use the example of like feelings being like children. Don't let them drive the car, but don't lock them in the trunk. So it's helping. The respect is also, I think, finding that balance there. Hey, you can't letting the part know you're not going to be able to drive the car. I'm going to, try to make good balanced decisions. But on the other hand, if you're upset about something, I'm not going to lock you in the trunk. I want to hear what you're upset about. I want to understand it. Now that can be complex in working with psychosis because, the parts, often it's kind of squirrely, the way things are coming out is kind of disguised. And again, to quote Eleanor Longden, she said that the symptoms reflect the unspeakable secret while also deflecting attention away from the secret. And sometimes it's not so much a secret as something the person doesn't know how to put into words, or it's something that's coming out of a conflict between parts and things are coming out sideways. But there, I think one way to deal is just get curious what's below the surface. And compassion-focused therapy, they use the story of the Wizard of Oz. When Dorothy goes in to see the wizard, there's this big booming thing, there's big, bass and booming voice. But then Toto goes and pulls the curtain aside, and there's this little man pulling levers. And so often, if you look behind what seems like the scary psychotic experience or whatever, there's something that's much more understandable. Even when I'm talking with people about their voices, like often, why do you do what the voice says? Well, it just keeps asking over and over. Well, if you had a kid that kept asking for cookies over and over, would you give it to him? It's like, maybe it's the same kind of thing. Maybe what it really is the kid needs a nap. You got to look underneath. There could be a few other things I could go over, like are we trying to change dysfunctional beliefs and behaviors, or are we trying to unburden or heal wounded parts? In IFS, they talk about unburdening. But if you really listen to them in IFS, well, what is unburdening? Oh, it's helping people let go of the beliefs they don't need anymore. Oh, changing beliefs. That's very much like CBT. But it's, again, they emphasize more that if you help the person be ready, they will just release it. But I think actually in good CBT, that's the way it's done too. You're not trying to confront people and make them give up a belief. You're trying to help explore things until the person just naturally falls into a more balanced perspective. One thing in IFS I definitely disagree with. They say parts can only hurt us if we're afraid of them. And I think that's definitely true. That's one way they hurt us. But actually parts can hurt us also if we trust them too much. Like one of my clients has voices that like they would lead him on all sorts of wild stuff. Like once he's in a bad snowstorm and the voices are like, oh, you don't need to do anything. You know, your dad's coming along shortly and is going to pick you up. Well, actually his dad was in another state, you know, not so likely. And yeah, and IFS, they would say, oh, therapy is about teaching skills, but really, you know, then they do talk later, though, you'll hear them say, oh, the parts need to learn to trust the self. Wait a minute, that sounds like a skill, learning something. So often that, you know, if you pay attention, even though they use different language, it really is a common process. Oh yeah, this is a, just this diagram shows that people are working on how, you know, to understand the self in different ways. And this comes from acceptance and commitment therapy approach to working with and psychedelic therapy. And I'm not completely endorsing this graphic, but I do think it shows how people are struggling with this. And it's kind of interesting. If you look at the top of that, they're talking about experience of self where you feel, you know, like we feel radical acceptance and one with everything. And, you know, it can be when I first did psychedelics, I tried to identify with that state of mind. But I tried to get there by disowning those traumatized parts inside that I didn't want to deal with, you know, my wounded parts. And a better approach, which took me many years to learn, was to be, as IFS would put it, to compassionately be with, but not in, those traumatized parts, so that I could comfort them and soothe them and help them heal. And that's really, you know, what I think we're trying to do here. And remember when I said we can think of parts as being like whirlpools or waves within a body of water? There's a story about two waves that illustrate something about this. Some of you might have heard this before. Anyway, there's a big wave and there's a smaller wave, and they're kind of traveling together. And suddenly the big wave gets all upset and says to the smaller one, oh no, I see rocks ahead. All the waves are getting smashed. That's going to happen to us. And the little wave says, oh, don't worry, it'll be okay. And no, says the big wave, I can see it, but you can't. We're about to be obliterated. Oh, says a little wave, but maybe you've forgotten. We're not just waves, we're the ocean. Or sometimes I've heard it said, we're not just waves, we're the water. So the wisdom of the little wave is knowing that it's more than just the part it's playing at the moment. Or it's being a little wave, but it's really just part of the ocean. It can get smashed around and then recover and can play other roles. You know, and in psychosis, people often find that they are getting smashed or broken in some ways. And when we really listen to them and their dilemmas, we might find that our own ideas about how minds work are getting stretched or smashed or broken. But one good thing can be that sometimes when our smaller ideas or identities get smashed, we can be pushed into a healing journey where we discover deeper ideas and a deeper identity, like that sense of being the ocean. You know, and it's hard work to handle psychotic or extreme experiences or to help someone else handle them. But it can also be deeply amazing when we find the compassionate self and we help others find their compassionate self, and that sense within us that you know, we are the ocean and it's all connected and can be dynamically alive in each moment. And when we can find a way to communicate with all the parts of us that they can participate in this, and we can all work together to make it happen. So I hope this talk has just given you a few ideas about how that can be done and how to, you know, put into action that balance and integration that we've been talking about. So now I guess we can be open to a few questions. One back.
Invite both our virtual attendees and IRL in real life attendees to ask questions. Who has a question? Okay.
Hey, I really appreciate the work you're doing, trying to bring together CBT and IFS. I was recently home in New York City, and this friend of mine said to me, yeah, I have this new IFS therapist now who actually is like really good. For 5 years, I had a CBT therapist who was only just talking to my managers. And I think it's really, like, you didn't talk about the manager, exile, firefighter thing, but it's something I think about a lot. What part of us is talking? What part are we listening to? And you're giving me you make me curious to want to learn more about CBT, because I do have these very negative associations with it. So, yeah.
I think a lot of CBT can be shallow, but it really isn't following the principles of CBT as laid out, at least by the better people, so it can be done in different ways.
Thank you, Ron. I'm curious, I'm not a clinician, so I have no expertise in this. I'm just curious in the process of helping somebody to recognize this construct of having parts. Is that a difficult process? Does that take a long time? Or how do you help somebody to think about that?
Yeah, it's often, doesn't take a long time. It's often just, as you appreciate the complexity, it's often the person will say, I feel this. And it's like, oh, part of you is really feeling that. And are there any other parts that feel any other way? And it's often just naturally comes out, that the person is aware they have parts, Even in something like, I call myself stupid. Well, in a way, there's a part of me that's calling me stupid and a part of me that's being called stupid and might resent being called that, So it really follows pretty easily.
I apologize. I missed some because of a phone call. So you may have already addressed this, but I'm trying to think through using more of a parts approach. And I personally worked with quite a few people who part of what was so difficult for them was that they had actually really pushed the part of themselves that responded to voices or beliefs pretty far outside of themselves. To the point that they feel that the voice or the belief is they are helpless toward it, and they're just surviving whatever it's doing to them. And it sounds like, if I got it right, a lot of people in healing through parts therapy are kind of naming a part of them that is the voice or responds to the voice. What is the process like? Or is that the process, trying to help a person recognize a part that is associated with the experience that they might want to get away from?
So,
sorry, poorly formed question.
So it can get a little complex. Like there might be like a part of them that's expressing itself as a voice. There might be a voice hearer that's a voice hearing part that gets very intimidated by that. And for example, in compassion focused therapy, they will often talk to both. Like, let's say you've got a critic, because a lot of people, even if you don't hear voices, you have a critic, and then you have a part of you that gets intimidated by being the critic, right? And then they'll explore both of those, and then they'll have the person get into the role of compassion itself and relate to both of those. They'll relate to the critic from the point of view of the compassion itself. They'll relate to the part that gets intimidated by the critic from the point of view of the compassion itself, and help both of those parts. So it can get kind of complex. I'm only touching on it here, but yeah, I'm not sure if I'm getting to what you were saying, but.
So maybe in that example, the critic is kind of the part of the self that might be reflected in the voice, and the part that's intimidated is the part that responds to the voice.
Yeah, that's right. Often what people call voices is very much like what those of us who don't hear voices call a critic, which, it's just that we're framing it as part of themselves, where somebody that hears voices might be, they're so much into, I shouldn't have a part of me that thinks that way. That must be something else or whatever.
I totally agree, especially with that part. I do think one thing that individuals with voice hearing maybe will buckle at about that last comment is that the intensity of sometimes what they hear, it sometimes can feel insulting to them to hear that someone else, like, that's just like your critic talks to you like that. Because, and so I think it's worth really respecting when we point out, and I know you do, so I'm not worried, but really respecting when we point out to someone that we might have a similar experience, that it still may be very dramatically different. I think one thing that I really also was noticing, because I absolutely love your talks, I think timeline's really important, because so often we come to something like this and we hear the idea of, all right, I'm going to introduce parts and we're going to work through this in a session. And it's like, people deserve time, to just become accustomed either to this whole idea of looking at different parts or looking at our experience differently. And I think over time, we can really, whether habituate's a fair word, really have a different perspective. And I think we deserve time to do that. And I think, again, I know you, so I followed you for so long that I know that that's a piece of what you do. And I think it's really worth remembering, not only for our client, but for ourselves. I mean, obviously I'm a therapist, so that's how I define, but like, we all deserve time to make change and integrate it into our life. So, but again, thank you so much. I think it's a great presentation.
I'm just going to check to see if there are online questions, and then if not,
I'm not seeing anything online.
nada. Okay.
I feel really struck by the diagram that you showed and what you spoke about, how briefly your psychedelic experience, you were trying to reach the higher states on that diagram without then actually maybe acknowledging or approaching the more fundamental levels. And I feel really interested also in what Sasha said about perhaps like CBT only speaking to like a manager part in the IFS system. So I feel really curious about this idea of how do we not kind of skip over and go towards what is often in common rhetoric of like what we're aiming for, right? Which is, oh, I can be compassionate towards myself, or, oh, I can be grounded, or whatever, these kind of buzzwords, without skipping over these parts that aren't resolved and maybe are being buried alive. That's very broad, but.
Yeah. The other word for what I was trying to do is called a spiritual bypass. Some of you probably are familiar with that. Now, interestingly enough, I would actually argue that because spiritual bypass is often talking about, no, that's very bad. I actually thought it was very helpful to me, because I was, a kid that had gone through a lot of abuse and bullying and felt horrible about myself. So just bypassing all that and getting to this place where I could feel great and, one with everything, I mean, it was nowhere to stay stuck, but just the fact that I could get there and know that there was that possibility really helped me get strong enough that I could do the trauma work. And then, how do we do it? I think, well, the more you can evoke compassion just naturally starts working in that way. And the idea of compassionate towards all our parts. And we're not just trying to live inside a part of us that feels okay, but the part of us that feels okay gets curious about the parts that don't feel okay. And okay, so these parts feel great. That's good. What about the parts of me that aren't so great? And it's still a work in progress. I mean, I still find, that I've got parts pushed to the side that aren't feeling so good, getting better at tuning into them. Oh, why does part of me not feel so great about this? What does that part need? I
think we have time for about one more question.
I'm sitting here and I'm feeling this feeling, and I'm trying to like it's like this uncomfortable feeling. I was like, what is it? What is it? And then it's like the memory comes back. I spent those 3 years, like, Ron, I worked at the New York State Psychiatric Institute at the first episode Psychosis program, where CBT for psychosis was like one of the modalities that they did with the young people that were coming into that program. And I liked the woman who was the trainer, she was my supervisor, and I had respect for her, but I ended up just feeling like there was such a lack of, just like such a missed opportunity, to really connect with these kids. And when I discovered IFS and really started engaging with it, I was like, oh, I mean, I guess I'm basically saying the same thing I just said a few minutes ago, but I'm putting it in this context of psychosis programs, and because I know that you do cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, and I guess you can say to me, well, they just weren't doing it right, you know, and I do it right, or what, you know. But I guess it once again, I don't have enough really to like push back and say there's something about this stuff that's like just leaving out like whole swaths of the human experience, but that's how it feels.
Yeah, well, I think in whatever our modality is, I mean, we always have to be working to stretch it to the things that it doesn't fit. Reminded of what Bill O'Hanlon said about, you know, when he went to graduate school, you know, he was taught a method to do therapy. And the idea was you went out and practiced therapy that way. And if it worked, great. And if it didn't, that meant your patient was being resistant. Later, he learned that means you better learn other ways of approaching and helping people because your way was not adequate for them. And I'm definitely in favor of that. You know, I think this ideas in CBT work for some people some of the time, but we need to keep stretching it and finding ways to make it reach, you know, more people. And whether it's not recognizable as CBT anymore at the time you stretch it far enough, well, that's great. I mean, ultimately, like, let's learn how to connect with people and help them. So thanks for being here. Thanks for coming.